Thank you, Member for Swan. Question is that the bill now be read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is an attack on aspiration. This bill is designed to stop people from being able to access higher education unless they have the financial wherewithal to pay their way through. It is pricing people out, and it is being widely condemned by people, regardless of what people say in here. Out in the broader community, people know exactly what this is doing. This is injecting unfairness within Australian society, a society that has always valued at its core the fact that with merit people can get ahead, with talent they'll have opportunity, that they don't need to always be from a well-off background to be able to get ahead. We always celebrated the fact that in this country we were classless. But when you see what is happening here, this is designed to keep to one class of people, the people that have the financial resources and capacity. This is the only avenue. These are the people that will have the opportunity for higher education, not for anyone else. And in my region, I actually had the opportunity recently to talk with someone who was once the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and who graduated actually from the high school I went to in Western Sydney, Mitchell High. And he was the second person from my high school in the late 70s to actually go to university at that point in time, the school being opened 50 years ago, and in a short space of time after the Whitlam reforms, he was able to get into university, and the local community literally had a party, literally celebrated the fact that someone from there, without necessarily having the resources, had opened up to them the chance to go to university. And what do we have now? After all that progress, we have the winding back. We have the move to basically entrench university to privilege and to income, and to not allow, to deny it to others. And when we raise these points, those opposites say, oh, well, you're just engaging in class war. You've opened up the class war. When you have denied people the chance who have the ability but not the money to go to university, you're opening up that class war. So don't for 1 minute try and suggest that this is all about enacting or enraging a class war that exists. You're opening it up by these very reforms. University of Western Sydney, university I was proud to graduate from, basically can boast, and is something we should all celebrate, that 65 out of every 100 students are the first ones out of their family to be able to go to university. First ones. In my own family, my dad immigrating in the late 60s, when I look at my extended family back overseas, there's not too many. I could count on one hand how many actually got to university. And how grateful are we that in this nation you've got a chance to be able to go ahead and to get ahead by being able to go to university. So why would we want to do what is being proposed here? To cut. There are three elements to what's being proposed. First, to cut by 37% the public funding to universities. Second, to open up, because the coalition knows that if they cut that funding, they've got to make up, the universities cannot simply survive without this level of funding ripped out. What's the second thing they do? They say, well, we'll open up, we'll let you set the fees that you think you can set for the courses that you're providing. So they're doing that. And then the third thing they're doing is crippling or expanding the student debt, or the amount of debt that students have to carry in paying off their fees, and in particular changing the interest rate that's charged on loans, going from CPI to the bond rate, going from about 2% to 6% in rough terms, lifting that. And when you consider the combination of those things, you realise that this becomes a financial decision, something that, instead of being able to go on, as I said earlier, to get ahead and improve yourself, you're actually having to weigh up whether or not you'll be able to afford it. And in the terms that have been expressed by Saul Eslak in the Hobart Mercury back in June, he said it would be irrational for people not to consider the cost in relation to their working life in the same way as when you borrow a house. He's making reference to the fact that people will weigh up whether or not they can afford to go to university. This is wrong. And when you have, for instance, in the justification for these reforms, you have the Education Minister saying, well, cleaners and nurses are paying for the education of university students. I have never had anyone run up to me in the street and grab me by the shirt front and say, I don't want to pay for education. I want us to have a dumber nation, not a smarter one. No one ever runs up to you in the street and says that. Everyone recognises that education is not a cost to this nation. They recognise it's an investment in its future prosperity, not just for the individual, but making sure that there are people around within our economy that have got the skills to keep it running. In a climate where we have skill shortages across a range of areas, and to be able to then put in place a system or a scheme like this that would deny people the ability to go into higher education and then deny our economy the talents of those people, it defies logic. It defies logic to be able to consider that that is a worthwhile scheme. But that is exactly what is being proposed right here. And so I go back, as I said, to the fact that in my region, in Western Sydney, where we finally got, as a result of the Dawkins reforms under the Hawke-Keating government, we finally got our own university, and I was amongst the first wave of people that graduated from that university. We finally had our own university in Western Sydney. And I'm sure that was the same in other parts of the country too, that had to travel long distances and never had tertiary education at their doorstep, had to travel long distances to get that education. So we've got it in our region. It is now actually opening up the doors of universities to families that never thought that they would be able to do it. And now what we're having is people being priced out of it. Because this is what will happen, and this is what universities have actually told me will be more than likely to happen. The stronger universities will jack up the prices. They will jack up the fees for those courses, and we've already heard a whole scale of fees proposed or likely to be confronting people, some of which over $100,000 for some courses, and forcing students to work or pay that off for the best part of their working lives. Some universities will jack up their fees, but there'll be others that know that they can't, that they simply, for the people that they tailor their courses to and in the regions that they operate, they will not be able to lift their fees in the same way. And so you've got this double-barrelled impact of not being able to charge the fees at the same time trying to deal with the fact that you're not getting the funds from government and the support from government that once existed. And so what happens with those universities? They basically shrivel, they lose their capacity to deliver education to the same quality and standard that they previously did, while the big universities, the established universities that are concentrated in capital cities, they flourish. How is that fair? How is it fair that we are being told that you should have a different standard of education based on where you live? It is not right. It flies in the face of everything we've done in terms of education reform in this nation to make it more accessible. And what gets me, and I'm just talking about my area of Metro Sydney, what about the areas that the Minister represents or the Nationals represent? I mean, we have not heard one thing out of them actually resisting what is being proposed. Because if that two-tiered system of education that denies quality education to people that live in regions affects the people I represent in Western Sydney, what about the people that the Minister represents or his colleagues in the National Party? I mean, the last time I checked, your surname was Joyce, not Doorstep. You're not a doormat allowing these people to be able to walk all over the people you represent and to deny them the right to be able to deny them the right to be able to get a quality education. And the fact of the matter is, Minister, I have spoken up on issues when my community's affected. When my community's affected, you're too busy talking, not busy listening, that you wouldn't recognise or remember the times that I've spoken up. And so the fact of the matter is, your side is allowing the other side of the coalition to bring in these reforms and to deny the people that you represent the quality education that they should get. So what you should be doing, and what every National Party member should be doing, is joining with the Labor Party and saying this is not good enough for the nation. This is simply unacceptable to the welfare of the nation that you would allow this reform through. And you look at some of the other things, there's other impacts that come through with this in terms of what's being proposed. The legislation we debate now enables, in terms of $3.9 billion of these cuts, it will slash funding for Commonwealth-supported places in undergraduate degrees by roughly 20% on average. Some courses it's nearly 40%. Reduces the indexation arrangements for university funding to CPI in 2016, and it's down from the appropriate rate that Labor previously in government had introduced. That means about $202 million in cuts over forward estimates. But it's a major contributor to a $2.5 billion per annum shortfall in 10 years' time, and those are the stats generated by the Parliamentary Budget Office. Cuts almost $174 million from research training schemes, which support the training of Australian research students, introduces fees for PhDs, and as I reflected upon earlier, introduces a real rate of interest on HECS, moving from CPI to the 10-year bond rate capped at 6%. I mean, this is just some of those changes that are being put forward. In terms of fee deregulation, we get told that there won't be substantial fee hikes, but nowhere in the world has deregulation of university fees led to the price competition that's being extended or promised by those opposite and by the minister. And it hasn't led to lower fees. And in fact, in the UK, fees were deregulated in 2012. There was a cap of £9,000. And for the 2015-16 academic year, there will only be 2 universities out of 123 that will not be charging £9,000 fees. And why is that? Because price is an indicator of quality, and those universities that initially charged less actually suffered because they were perceived not to be as good. So the competition doesn't lead to lower prices, it actually leads to an acceleration amongst universities to see who can jack up their prices to attract students. And we should be spending more time in attracting students and attracting quality education than going into a bidding war between universities. Now we have those opposites say, well, the universities support us. And as I actually reflected on yesterday, of course the universities are going to support this. What choice do they have? What choice do they have? When you look at the universities who are having their funding potentially cut, they've got no choice but to support fee deregulation. And it is pretty much the hostages reflecting favourably on the captors because they've got nowhere else to go. If they don't support fee deregulation, they're not going to get money out of government, and the only thing that the universities have actually spoken up against is the move to change the interest rates on the student loans. But that's not good enough, because they know as educators and as people who operate within their regions that doing what they're proposing, doing what the government's proposing, will actually impact on the welfare of the people that they work with, that they live with, and that they feel a responsibility to. Now, we've had some other comments made through the course of this debate, and I've listened to some coalition MPs in their contributions, and they've said reform isn't easy. Like they're making out that this has taken a great deal of courage. Oh yeah, it's really courageous to basically tell people before an election that you won't do any of this, that you won't charge fees, that you won't cut university funding, and then what do you do when you come in? You cut it. And not just in terms of the changes here in higher ed. I mean, we've already commented on and fought and resisted strongly what's being done in terms of education. You look at the combination of impact for health and education, $80 billion cut out of there, plus these changes in terms of higher education, which is an absolute outrage. But where's the courage? Reform isn't easy. Reform is easier when you're honest. Reform is easier when you're upfront. Reform is easier when you've taken people into your confidence and let them know what you're doing and why. And if it is hard, building the support for it. Not basically doing what is happening now, breaking a promise and holding universities to ransom that if they don't support it, they won't get the money that's required to undertake education. And the other comment that I heard quite often, it must be in their talking points, is you have to deal yourself into the game. This is what the coalition's saying to us, Member Filingari. They're saying you have to deal yourself into the game. Really? When you look at this mob, the last time they were in the last term, I should say, of the parliament, when we were inviting everyone to work on the big issues and trying to get cross-party groups together on some of the big issues, like, for example, climate change, who was the only group that didn't get involved? The coalition. And they're now saying to us we should get involved in this process. This isn't an invitation to be involved in what they're doing. This is an invitation to underwrite, basically, the ripping apart of our university system and undermining education in this country. And it's simply not something that we're prepared to do, and as has rightly been pointed out, we will fight every step of the way, and we should fight every step of the way. And for people in my area and in the people in the area that I represent, We will fight this because this does not represent your best interests longer term. It doesn't represent the nation's best interests, and more than anything else, it is a breach of trust by the coalition that is being allowed to do this by a compliant National Party, allowing the Liberal Party to get away with blue murder.